for probably over about 15 years now. And I think it boils down to you've got to make a decision whether or not you decide that the SEN team at your local authority are either willfully trying to avoid their duties. That's option one, that's the more cynical option. Or option two, which I think is more realistic, is that frankly there's just not enough money in the system. I started the previous presentation by just talking about the numbers that are involved, and I think it's worth revisiting that. So the NHS website for dyslexia suggests that around about 1 in 10 people have dyslexia. I don't suggest for a moment that every single person with dyslexia would require an education, health and care plan, but dyslexia is a special educational need simply by its definition. So 1 in 10 people have dyslexia, and there are roughly just under 9 million pupils in England at the moment. That's to say that there is just under, therefore, 1 million pupils in England with a specific special educational need of dyslexia. And if each of those pupils requested a statutory assessment of those needs, the cost of just assessing those needs would run into billions. It would also obviously be incredibly difficult practically to assess all of those pupils and determine whether or not they would need an EHCP. So there is an obvious issue there, which once you understand the numbers involved and the costs involved, you begin to understand why gatekeeping systems are introduced, which sometimes, quite often, conflict with actually what the legal duties are. Roger has very kindly agreed to click through the presentation for us to avoid any crashing. So next slide, please, Roger. I should say as well, you'll see me looking to the left every now and again this way. That's just so I can see a second screen so I can keep track of the presentation. So as we see there, content of this training, as I've said, I want to go through how the SEN system works. This is for England specifically. We'll talk about school-based intervention, when and how to apply for an EHCP, what that EHCP should contain, and then crucially, I've got 3 slides, I think it's 3 slides of myths at the end. That will probably be the most interesting section, especially if you're already fairly conversant with the pure law around all of this. Next slide, please, Roger. So this is the starting point for everything, and this is the definition of special educational need. This becomes encrusted with other requirements, other rules and policies from local authorities, and also has been developed by case law. But the statutory starting point is that a child or a young person is a pupil up to the age of 25, has special educational need if they have a learning difficulty which requires special educational provision. So there's 2 points within that. Number one, they've got a learning difficulty, so we need to know what learning difficulty is. And number two, we need to know what special educational provision means. So next slide, please, Roger. So this is the first bit, what is a learning difficulty? And this is where the comparisons start to creep in. So a learning difficulty is a significantly greater difficulty in learning than peers, or a disability that makes it difficult to use facilities provided in school or college. Now, facilities has been defined in case law to be anything in a school or college, and that can include toilets, playground, corridors, anything. Specifically for dyslexia, there will obviously be particular facilities that a young person will struggle with in terms of accessing written or potentially even verbal instructions. The comparison point there obviously is a significantly greater difficulty. So it may be, and I stress may be, that in some instances, a young person's dyslexia would be having such a mild impact that they may not amount to a special educational need. However, in my experience, I have never known that to be the case. So it's worth presupposing that that a learning difficulty will always be satisfied following identification of dyslexia. Next slide then, please, Roger. So then this is the second bit of the legal test. So the first bit was what is a learning difficulty. The second bit is what is a special educational provision. And it can actually be very easily summarized. It's anything which is different to that which every other pupil will get in a mainstream school. So any form of differentiation, any form of extra time, any specialist equipment, any different printed materials, anything that is done specifically for this pupil, which isn't done for every other pupil, amounts to special educational provision. So it's very, very broad. So again, the actual legal test for special educational need is very, very broad and can be quite easily satisfied. And it basically boils down to, is the young person struggling to access education, and do they need something, anything beyond that that is rolled out for every other pupil? And if the answer is yes, then that person has special educational needs. Crucially, a diagnosis is not required, and you will see there is no reference to the need for a diagnosis in that definition. Next slide then, please, Roger. So, school-based intervention. The starting point and the expectation is that schools, nurseries, any professional that's involved with a young person from birth has a statutory obligation to keep an eye open to see whether or not they consider that child as special educational needs. If they do, in any educational institution, including nurseries, the starting point is school-based intervention, which follows the cycle of assess, plan, do, review, which I'm sure many of you will be very well familiar with. But effectively, it's a termly cycle, and it's similar to the old IEP system under the statement regime. So the plan is that at the beginning of a term, the school should assess the child's needs, plan the provision for that term, and over the course of that term, do it, and then at the end of the term, review it. And then that becomes a termly cycle. It doesn't have to be termly, but that is the general recommendation. But you'll note that that is heavily requiring the school to assess and plan. That obviously becomes more complicated the more significant and severe the needs may be. So that is why, and we'll come to this myth shortly, that is why there is actually no requirement to exhaust any assess, plan, do reviews cycles before moving into the statutory regime of EHCPs. To be clear, the school-based intervention is exactly that. It is school-based, it's run by schools. They can opt to seek some specialist advice from an educational psychologist or a speech therapist or an occupational therapist or hearing impairment teacher or a teacher of the deaf, whatever it may be. The school can choose to do it, but actually requiring an assessment, a formal assessment, can only be done through the EHCP route. So if there are concerns that the school may not be able to properly identify the need or isn't able to properly deliver the provision, then you should be thinking about moving into the EHCP system. So then next slide, please, Roger. So this is the starting point. If you've got concerns that the needs are so significant that the school is going to need some extra support to be able to support your young person, or the cycles of assess, plan, do, review have been trialed and it simply isn't yielding any progress, or you've got an independent report saying this young person needs an EHCP, this is the starting point. Parents or the young person, if they're over the age of 16, or the school can request a needs assessment from the local authority. And that request can be made in writing. It can be done by email. It can be done by a phone call. Most local authorities have a form that you have to fill out. I have to be honest, I never fill out those forms. It's better, in my view, to send in a letter which addresses this two-part test, which is here. So the two-part test is firstly that the child or young person might have special educational needs. So it's not even a definite at that stage, and we've already covered what special educational needs are. And then the second part of the test is that it might be necessary for the provision, SEP stands for Special Educational Provision, to be made by issuing an education healthcare plan. So there's effectively, you don't have to provide definitive evidence of either at the point of requesting a needs assessment. What you do have to provide evidence of is that there is a possibility that the young person has special educational needs, as we've already discussed. And there is also a possibility that they will need an EHCP. And the way of proving that is to suggest that extra funding might be required, or a specific TA is required, or specialist teaching, or time for overlearning and practicing of particular skills is going to be required. Again, it's crucial that you know that at this point in the process, there is no requirement on the applicant for a needs assessment to even set out what provision they think the young person needs, because that's the point of the assessment process itself. All you need to be able to do is show that there is enough evidence to suggest that the child might have needs and that they might need an EHCP. And that is a very, very low threshold. Next slide, please, Roger. I think we've already covered the first bullet point there. So the request can be made by the parents, the young person if they're over the age of 16, or the school or college. It's important to know if the school or college intend to make the request, they should also be informing the parent or the young person. The needs assessment itself, which is the second bullet point there, is a process whereby the local authorities seek advice from various organisations and people. There's a statutory minimum, and that statutory minimum is that advice must be sought from the parents, views of the young person should be sought, advice from the school through the head teacher, involvement from any involved medics, and that will include any involved therapists, including, in my view, private therapists. Local authority must seek advice from an educational psychologist, also from social care, and also, if relevant, advice from a teacher for visually impaired or hearing impaired. It's also important to note that local authority must also seek advice from anyone else that parents reasonably request. So, for example, if you've been commissioning advice from a specialist teacher for dyslexia for the last 6 months, it would be entirely appropriate for the local authority to take advice from that specialist teacher, and they must seek that advice because it would be entirely reasonable. I have never seen a local authority tell parents of that duty. So whenever I receive agreement from a local authority to make a needs assessment, that's the first thing I tell parents to think about is who else other than the minimum should we be asking the local authority to take advice from. Next slide, please, Roger. So this provides your timescales. During the COVID lockdown, heaps of new regulations were issued out at very short notice. But the cumulative effect was that many of the statutory timescales, as well as many of the other duties, were suspended. All of those regulations have now been removed. So we're back onto these timescales. So week 0 is the point that the request for a needs assessment is made. The local authority, 6 weeks after receiving that request, have to decide whether or not to make the assessment. And as we'll come to shortly, if they refuse, then a right of appeal kicks in. All things being equal, if the local authority agree at the end of week 16, the local authority then will have completed the needs assessment. So that's 16 weeks from the point of the request. The local authority will have completed the assessment and they will write you with either a draft EHCP or a letter saying we don't think that an EHCP is needed. That is then when a second appeal might kick in. So if the local authority refused to make an EHCP, you can appeal that decision. If you get issued with a draft EHCP, you need to go through it carefully, and we'll talk shortly about what is actually in the EHCP. You need to go through it carefully to make sure that all the needs are properly recorded there. And then the crucial bit, make sure the provision is actually detailed. Something more than access to differentiated materials is preferable. Well, in fact, it's the duty on the local authority, but you'll often find, or almost always find, provision is written in very vague terms. So you need to make sure that it's corrected. And then again, as long as everything is not challenged and that there are agreements throughout, at the point of week 20, you have a final EHCP in your hand, which will tell you the school that the child is going to go to and the provision that will be made available for them there. Again, at that week 20 point, if you're not happy with the school, if you want a different school, a specialist school, or you're not happy with any of the provision, you then can appeal that as well. Next slide, please, Roger. So, drafting the EHCP. I have to be honest, the contents of the EHCP is by far the majority of the work that I undertake. Securing an assessment is relatively straightforward. Securing an EHCP itself is relatively straightforward. It's the content of the EHCP that is often the most significant issue. And that's not surprising because, frankly, that's where the money starts being relevant to the local authority. There is a code of practice, 2015 code of practice sets out this entire system, but you'll find at 9.62 onwards what an EHCP should contain. It's broken down and must be broken down into different sections, A through to K, and we'll see those on the next slide. But in my view, fairly unhelpfully, when this new system was introduced, the Department for Education decided to allow every local authority to create their own formats for EHCPs, which means that there are hundreds of different versions and each local authority constantly seem to be updating them as well. But as a minimum and as a guide, they must contain these sections A to K. The EHCP must set out all of the identified needs, and it must identify provision in a specified way. And I'll come back to what that means shortly. Very often there is confusion between what is an educational need, what is a health need, and what is a social care need. The easiest way of thinking about it is that if the provision will have the effect of educating or training a young person, then the need that gives rise to that provision is an educational need. That's a bit around the houses way of thinking about it, but effectively, if the difficulty that we're thinking about requires education or teaching or training, then that is an educational need rather than a health need or a social care need. Next slide, please, Roger. So these are the various sections of an EHCP, A through to K. You can see them all there for yourselves, but really the crucial bits are sections B, F, and I. And I say that they're crucial because they're really the only sections that you can immediately appeal or directly appeal to the tribunal. And those sections address the educational need, the educational provision, and the school placement. It's worth bearing in mind that even though they're called education, health, and care plans, the driver for this whole system is educational need. You cannot get an EHCP just because you've got health needs. You cannot get an EHCP because you've got social care needs. You must have educational needs. You can then bolt on your health provision and your social care provision, but the gateway and the driver for all of this is always education. So section B will set out all the identified special educational needs. So maybe a diagnosis of dyslexia or a presentation of dyslexia, in which case we'll need to talk about the respective level of severity, whether or not we've got any comparative scores of what's the young person actually able to do versus age-related expectation, any assessed percentile scores, practical information which will give the reader a clear understanding of how the need actually impacts the young person, rather than just simply, this person has dyslexia, full stop. That's not particularly helpful. The provision then goes into section F and the school placement into section I. You'll see that I've written in bold and underlined they're appealable. That's because the education bits are the bits that you can appeal to the SEN tribunal. If you are then appealing the education bits, and it can be one or all of them, the tribunal is currently running a national trial, which has been extended and will continue to be extended, I suspect, which gives the tribunal the ability to make recommendations about the health and the social care sections. Those are recommendations. They're not immediately binding, but again, in my experience, the local authorities tend to go along with what tribunals recommend. Next step, please. Sorry, next slide, please, Roger. So we've talked a lot about appealing. There are alternatives, really mediation and a discussion. We'll come on to that in the next slide. But it's crucial that you're aware of what the deadlines are. So following any decision, so a refusal to assess, a refusal to issue, or an issue of a final EHCP, or indeed any decision following an annual review of an EHCP, an appeal must be brought within 2 months of either the decision itself or within 2 months of a mediation certificate being issued. And you must at least consider mediation for all appeals. it becomes a bit convoluted, but effectively, once a decision is made, you have 2 months to appeal. If you decide to try mediation, that window for appealing can extend. So if you try mediation, you go through, you have a mediation meeting, and then you get issued with a mediation certificate. That can take, in my experience, anything up to a year. It shouldn't do, but it can do. You then get your mediation certificate. Within a month of that, you can still appeal. So as long as you're engaging with the mediation company in some way, that window can extend, but I wouldn't rely on it. It's best just to put 2 months in your diary from any decision. Next slide, please, Roger. So mediation certificates. If you're appealing just about the school placement, then you can go to appeal straight away. But if you're appealing sections B and F, you must at least consider mediation. So what that means is you get sent a decision, whatever that decision may be, and on that letter, the local authority will tell you the mediation company that it has contracted to work with. You have to phone them and speak to them, and they will explain what mediation is about. But effectively, it's a hosted meeting between you and the local authority where you come along and explain to the local authority what your concerns are. And in theory, the local authority officer should be able to take on board those points and make a decision there and then about whether or not to change the HCP. That's what the law requires. It requires that someone from the local authority attend that can actually make a decision. I have never known that to happen. What normally happens is the local authority officer attends and then says, I'll take those points back to the SEM panel. And then you have to wait another 4 weeks for a decision. That decision may well be, no, we're not going to do anything, in which case you then get your mediation certificate and then you go and appeal. Given that practical reality, my standard advice is not to try mediation because, quite frankly, it uses up time and requires a local authority to revisit a decision that is already made, and how often will anyone reverse their decision, especially if we're talking about considerable changes of provision which will have a financial impact. The point being, local authorities will issue an EHCP that they think is right or that they will consider is right, and it's very unlikely that going to a mediation meeting and you saying, I disagree, I think you're wrong, will actually result in anything, because a local authority has to willingly change its mind through mediation. Next slide, please, Roger. So this is the SEN tribunal. So if you decide you want to appeal and you go through the appeals process can take around about 3 or 4 months. It can be longer, depending on how busy the tribunal is. I was looking at some statistics recently that suggested that the number of appeals being brought to the tribunal has doubled every year in the last 3 years. It's certainly the busiest it's ever been. Some silver lining to the COVID lockdown has been that the SEN tribunal has introduced video hearings, which has incredibly effectively dealt with a backlog of hearings. Prior to lockdown, a good 75–80% of hearings were being adjourned because judges just weren't available. Because of the removal of travel and the availability of video hearings, I haven't since had an adjourned hearing, so that's a massive benefit. Anyway, the powers of the SEN tribunal, effectively, the SEN tribunal can reverse the decision of a local authority. And if it then decides to make that decision, for example, if the order is to make and maintain an EHCP, then the local authority must do that within 5 weeks. So what this slide gives you is effectively the timescales for compliance with tribunal orders. I've seen some people putting questions in the chat, and I'll definitely come to those at the end. And I know Roger's been emailed some questions as well. Next slide then, please, Roger. So myths. I don't propose to read through all of these, but these are all points that I have either been told directly from local authorities or clients of mine have been told by their SEN officer. They are all, every single one of these bullet points, all absolutely wrong. They don't have any foundation in law. So the first one, you can't get an EHCP for dyslexia. That's a very common one and is completely and utterly untrue. I have helped dozens of families secure HCPs for dyslexia and secure independent specialist school placements, even residential placements for pupils with dyslexia. So that's completely untrue. That then links into the second bullet point. EHCPs don't carry additional funding. Of course they do. That really actually is one of the major points of getting an EHCP, is so that the school can get some extra funds in so that they can afford to get a specialist teacher in, or they can afford a TA, or they can afford the adaptations that your child needs. Again, we've already discussed the bottom bullet point there. You have to complete a certain number of cycles of assess, plan, do, review before applying for an EHC needs assessment. Completely and utterly untrue. And it's very clearly untrue, actually, because you can tell from the SEN Code of Practice, which says that this system can happen from birth. So in theory, a young person could be identified with SEN at the point of birth, and be subject to a needs assessment. How you do that practically, I have no idea. But the legal position is that from birth, you can access this system. Now, if that can be true, then it would be impossible to have a certain number of cycles of assess, plan, do, review. Next slide, please, Roger. So again, some interesting myths here. You need to get a diagnosis to get an EHCP. Absolutely not. As I said earlier, the only consideration is the definition of SEN, and that definition, either in the statute book or in any case law, has never ever required a diagnosis. It's an assessment of how the young person's presentation is impacting their ability to access education. If it can be labelled or given a heading, that can be helpful, but it doesn't require it at all. Again, you can't get an EHCP in a mainstream school. Completely untrue. Vast majority of people with an EHCP will be in a mainstream placement. Next slide, please, Roger. And then again, local authority won't pay for private therapists through an EHCP. Again, not true. It's entirely possible to get your private therapist funded through an EHCP. Section J, if we scroll back, I'm not suggesting we do, but Section J of an EHCP covers personal budgets, which is effectively the local authority working out how much money the plan will cost the local authority. You can then have that fund allocated to you through a personal budget, which is a complicated process. I really haven't got time to go into it in great detail now, but you can secure a personal budget which can then be used for private therapists. Equally, if the local authority simply don't have access to an NHS therapist, it has no option but to secure private therapy through an EHCP. Again, particular diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, Down syndrome should go into a medical need, not an educational need. Absolutely untrue. And a local authority won't pay for residential placement unless social services and health contribute. Again, utterly, utterly untrue. If the only suitable school for your child, say a dyslexia school, and there are residential dyslexia schools, if the form of education requires, say, a particular class size, and that can only be delivered by a school 100 miles away, then that school will have to be a residential placement. You do not need to have social services and health contributing to that cost. And I think that takes us to the any further questions slide. So I'll just open up the chat. So I've got one question here. If a young person is under the age of 25, left school after GCSE, has a special plan for social anxiety and is seeking to take prerequisite modules to prepare for applying to a university course, can the person's parents seek an EHCP assessment? Or if the young person self-funds to take these prerequisites, would that make it possible to request an EHCP assessment? So taking that in sections, any person under the age of 25 can request a needs assessment. As long as it appears that they've got special educational needs and they require special educational provision, then you can request an assessment. Just sort of digesting that question a bit further. The only hesitation would be that if the form of education that is being considered would fall into higher education, and higher education is defined both in terms of the placement and the forms of education that are being followed. If it falls into higher education, then the EHCP would have to stop. So if these prerequisites would qualify as higher education, then you shouldn't be exploring the EHCP route. Then I've got another question. Hi, I'm just a bit confused as I was under the impression school had an obligation to spend their notional SEN budget, and this is what should be spent first. It was my understanding that an EHCP is for when the school cannot meet need utilising the SEND budget for that child. Is this not in any law in relation to EHCPs? That's a really good question, and this is one of the key problems that often kick in. Schools do get an allocated budget for SEN, and it can be useful to identify that the school needs more money than that budget in order to secure an EHCP, but that is absolutely not a barrier. So, for example, if the school has a budget of £5,000 and it's only spending £2,000, that does not mean that you shouldn't be thinking about an EHC needs assessment, and that certainly doesn't mean that you cannot access an EHCP. The reason for that is that the question is of necessity. So is it necessary for an EHCP to be issued in order for the young person to get an EHCP, in order to get the provision they need? Now, one of the practical questions will be, can the school afford it without an EHCP? So if the school can afford the provision without an EHCP, that's one of the questions of necessity. But there are other points, such as, can the school practically facilitate provision? Will the school be able to access specialist advice regularly enough without an EHCP? So, for example, it may well be that a school can access advice from an educational psychologist, but it needs to make a referral, and that referral can take up to 3 or 4 months to be processed, and then the educational psychologist will come in 2 or 3 months later. If a young person needs to be seen by an educational psychologist more often than that, then you will need an EHCP, because that will specify the frequency of the assessment and specify the frequency of the involvement. That's not a question of money, that's simply a question of ensuring that the provision is delivered. So the question of necessity is far more than simply, can the school afford it without an EHCP? Roger, I think you had emailed a few questions. Can you just remind me of those?
Yeah, there's a load of questions here for you. Make sure you can hear me okay. So here's one. Why is there not a uniform approach across local authorities? Why does the government allow it to have such diversity?
Well, there should be, is the easy answer to that. There should be a uniform approach. The legislation sets out very clearly what the fundamental rules are, and then that legislation is added to by regulations and code of practice, which all set out these fundamentals that I've been through. So in terms of what is special educational need, that is a set definition. The issue is that you will often find policies are written that supplement the law, and those policies can sometimes not be entirely consistent with what the legal duties are. And the reason for that is obvious, is quite understandable. Local authorities need to try and ensure that they have a consistent level of decision making. I'm not going to draw any adverse inference from that. Local authorities need to know that they are making consistent decisions. And so policies do need to be written, fair enough. The problem is those policies are then trained and distilled down through the system. And in my experience, at least, policy tends to drive decision making rather than law. So if there is understanding of policy only, that can create significant difficulties when, for example, a policy says, look at how much money is being spent as a primary consideration. That could be taken as that is the only consideration. And that is where then the confusion arises. So if a parent then asks for an assessment when provision doesn't cost more than £6,000, but the policy says, look at cost.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Sorry for cutting across you, but so many questions coming in. Questions come in, what does a parent do if they're living in a local authority which is not very supportive of dyslexia and refuses to do an assessment? And I'll just bring to mind here in Manchester, where I am, the MP Graham Stringer. For 10 years he was head of Manchester Council, and he always refused to admit that dyslexia even exists. And as a consequence, that was reflected in the policy of the council. What does somebody do who lives in an area like that to try and get the best provision for their child?
The short answer is be completely prepared to appeal, and frankly, probably have to appeal more than once. The problem is, quite often in this system, there is a presumption that local authorities will do their job properly always, which is fair enough. But that's the starting point. And then when a decision is made which is clearly wrong, it then falls to the parent to challenge that decision by way of an appeal. And that has to happen for every single decision. There is no umbrella body that can consider the general behaviour. I think that has begun to be addressed, though, because Ofsted is now, and has been for some time, looking into local authority SEN teams. And I think that has been in response to a growing concern in respect of very limited oversight of local authority decision-making processes. But on an individual basis, what to do is be ready to appeal. And the way that you be ready to appeal is gather data. So the data that you need to gather will be what interventions has my child or young person been receiving, try and monitor the progress, the assess plan do review, make sure the school is doing that, make sure the school is recording those reviews and keep those, keep a track of whether or not provision has been changed. If it hasn't, if you're just having the same provisions constantly and very little is changing, that would suggest a lack of progress, which would suggest a needs assessment may well be needed. Data is crucial on this. Information is king, and the information will be what interventions have been received. If none, then what have you done in terms of pushing the school to try and deliver interventions? Sadly, it's true, some schools will not be able to deliver the interventions either because they don't understand it or there's just a lack of desire to do that. That's a vast minority, but I have known certain schools to be resistant. And if that's the case, that meets your test of necessity. Is it necessary for provision to be made through an EHCP? If the school is refusing to do anything, then the answer is yes, absolutely. And I can say the answer is yes, absolutely, because there's an upper tribunal judgment that gave that decision several years ago and was in fact one of my cases.
Oh, well done, Ed. Ed, I've got so many questions for you.
Sorry, go on.
We need to really keep these answers short and sweet, if you don't mind. Can an EHCP be instigated via your GP?
In theory, yes. There is a duty on health professionals to monitor. I'm going to try and find it. Well, no, I probably don't have time, but it is within the Children and Families Act that any health professional that suspects that a young person may have special educational needs has a statutory duty to flag that to the local authority.
Okay. I'll do for now. That'll do for now, Ed. Another question. Do you see much diagnosis of dyscalculia in your work?
A fair amount, yes.
Okay, good. That's all. Just what the question asked. So that's cool. We're dealing with that. Question. Here we go. I'm going to be reading it out verbatim. Whilst there are three parts to where assessment sits: SEN, social care, and healthcare, where does this sit when one impacts the other? How can these at some point sit together so there is a holistic approach?
Sorry, Roger, you cranked up a bit there. I didn't quite follow.
Okay. Whilst there are three parts of where assessment sits, yeah, are you getting that?
Yeah.
Okay. SEN, social care, and healthcare. Where does this sit when one impacts the other? How can these at some point sit together so that there is a holistic approach? Okay.
So again, if you've got conditions that may be comorbid or co-impacting, so a health condition is exacerbating an educational need or the other way around. So a good example would be something like anxiety, then impacting school attendance, something like that. that's the point of the needs assessment, is that advice is taken from health professionals, social care and educational professionals. And then the driver of the whole system is education. So anything, even if it's identified by the GP, even if it's identified by a social worker, anything that impacts on a young person's ability to actually go to school or access learning for whatever reason, that is a special educational need. It can also be a health need. So in an EHCP, you can have the same thing identified in section B as an educational need and section G, I think, as a health need, is perfectly possible. But if it impacts on a young person's ability to go to school, attend school, receive learning, engage with learning, or benefit from learning in any way, then that is an educational need.
Thank you, Ed. Another question. This one is advice to parents. So say the parent has identified, they recognise some difficulties in their child, usually around year 2 in education, and they're finding it difficult to get schools support. What do you recommend? What advice do you give regarding keeping records of what, and keeping an eye on the progress and time frame for that parent? What do they need to be actually noting down? And what kind of advice can you give on that?
Okay, first thing to do, get in contact with the SENCO of the school, ask them, are they making use of assess, plan, do, review? If not, why not? And if they are, what is being done? Where are the records of the assess, plan, do, review? What have they done to assess? What have they done to plan? What have they done in terms of delivering the support? And then what have they done to review it? Ask to go to the review meetings of the assess, plan, do, review. If it isn't happening, ask for a specific meeting with the SENCO and minute it. Just to discuss why we're not doing assess, plan, do, review. If you have information from your school, so end of year reports or term year reports can be quite useful in terms of we're still learning the basic reading, or he's still stuck on the same level of book for a whole year or something like that. There will always be comments like that in school reports, in annual reports and end of term reports. If you see things like that, make a note of it, keep those reports, present them back to the SENCO and say, look, progress isn't being made here. What are we doing to identify the reasons for that lack of progress? And what are we doing to make provision? If the SENCO engages with you, brilliant, but keep a track of what is being done. If the SENCO doesn't engage with you, fine, you make a request for a needs assessment, because again, it may well be necessary for an EHCP to be delivered because the school isn't doing the assess, plan, do, review process.
Thanks, Ed. Another question from yesterday. A parent was saying that her son has just recently been diagnosed, but the school refuses to put an EHCP plan in place because they're saying school that the child is doing well enough. However, she's noticing that the child is struggling significantly with his mental well-being. She's saying that he's suffering with anxiety and lack of loss of self-esteem, and it's really starting to make him hate going into school. What would you advise in that scenario?
Exactly the same as I suggested previously. Have a meeting with the SENCO or email the SENCO so that it's recorded in writing, asking the questions. What are you doing? What are you doing now? We've got a diagnosis. That is a special educational need. It's simple as that. It is a special educational need. So what are we doing with assess, plan, do, review? And if we're not doing it, then you make your request for a needs assessment. Okay,
excellent, Ed. We're cracking through these questions really well. A question for you from somebody who lives in North Wales. And there have been questions in from other areas around the country that are expressing a very similar theme. There are certain local authorities that are hell-bent on using excuses like, and you'll have heard these before, they don't want to stigmatise the child, they don't want to label the child, or they won't do assessments. Now, that doesn't help the individual. If I had a broken arm, I need to know it's a broken arm. How do we kind of collate this data, and how do we start to challenge certain local authorities on a more open format so that we can get them to reconsider their stance?
That's quite a big question, really.
Sorry about that.
How do you change the mindset and attitude of a local authority? I'd love to know, or perhaps I wouldn't, because that would probably mean my practice would come to an end. In terms of raising issue with general behaviour, Ofsted and Estyn in Wales will be relevant. Judicial review, if it can be seen, if you can establish that there is a clear policy, even if it's an unwritten policy, it's perfectly possible to run a judicial review on the basis of what's called fettering discretion, which effectively means a local authority just complies rigorously with its own policy rather than actually looking at a matter on a case-by-case basis. Fundamentally, though, and as we discussed earlier, whilst the diagnosis can be helpful because it's a shorthand for a reader, you see dyslexia and you immediately think, right, okay, I've got a rough idea of what that might mean. A diagnosis or a label isn't the crucial point. The crucial point is what is actually this young person struggling with. So if you don't want to call it dyslexia, for an EHCP, you don't need to call it dyslexia. You can just say, this young person is presenting with X, Y, and Z difficulties in literacy, reading, understanding, whatever it may be, whatever the particular presentation is. So you could describe it by all the features of dyslexia. You just don't call it dyslexia. You call it by any name. You can give every description under the sun, but not call it dyslexia. Clearly, some people will want that diagnosis because it's an easy shorthand. It's the heading for the need, and I completely understand that. The only way of addressing that on an individual basis, I'm afraid, is to appeal. And if you're appealing on the basis of, I simply want my child's statement in Wales or EHCP in England to say dyslexia, I can't imagine that appeal not being successful if there is a diagnosis.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. If a child is now being home educated due to poor mental health as a result of unmet dyslexia needs, can you apply for an AHP to assess and provide advice and guidance with how to support your child in this situation?
You can do, absolutely. But what we're talking about there brings in a very specific area of law, which is education otherwise and at school, which can be very, very, very difficult. Taking a step back, if there is clear advice, medical advice, GP letters saying this person can't attend school, or clear emails to the school recording anxiety, if the school is saying, fine, just cannot get this young person to come in because of the difficulties they've got, that presentation, for whatever reason, would be enough to get a needs assessment. Because again, that young person isn't accessing the facilities at school because they're not going to school. It's as simple as that. The needs assessment will then be designed around focusing on why are they not going to school and what provision can be delivered to get them to go to school. If it is then impossible for that young person to go to any school, it is then possible to get education otherwise than at school, which is basically provision in the community or at home. But the statutory starting point is if you've got an EHCP, the presumption will be actually that the young person should be going to school or help to go back into school. And it's only on establishing that some or all of the provision the young person needs cannot be made in any school. It's only on that, establishing that fact, that you can then go into an education otherwise than at school setting. So if, for example, the young person anxiety is so extreme, there is no way that they can go to school. It is possible in the short term to get education otherwise than at school, but that provision will be focusing around not only their immediate educational needs, so dealing with literacy and numeracy in the curriculum, but also addressing the anxiety to try and encourage them to actually be able to go back into school. And it would only be after a failure of that provision totally that a long-term education otherwise than at school package would be considered, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, Ed. And I'm really minded of time. You and I both got meetings directly after this. So I'd like to finish up by giving you a big thank you, sharing your expertise and knowledge. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions that I've not had time to address. I've been scrolling frantically through the chat screen, through emails that have been bouncing in, and through stuff I've been having on text. So if we've not addressed your question, please email me again with the question. I'll forward it over to Ed and we'll try and work through it, get you a satisfactory answer. thanks all of you for joining us today. It's a really important subject area that, you know, the British Dyslexia Association recently reported on some research that they had done, that 80% of dyslexic pupils in 2020 are still leaving school without a diagnosis of their dyslexia. This is atrocious. We can't allow this to continue. We need a revolution in dyslexia. We need it to happen fast. There are lots of kids who are struggling with low self-esteem, low academic achievement, and we're just giving them no life chances, and we need to change it. And Ed, has been a small step in that direction. Thank you very much for your contribution. Excellent presentation, really succinct, really powerful and professional. Thank you very much. If you could share on social media that you've been attending today, that would be fantastic. Tweet about it, get on LinkedIn, let everybody know. I've got this recorded now, so happy to share. Thanks everybody for coming along today. And again, just a big thumbs up to Ed. Cheers, Ed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Bye, everybody. See you soon.